My husband and I went camping for the first time in Arizona as part of our long journey out west. I had chosen this pretty interesting location on a mountain overlooking a stunning countryside. It was near a cliff and in a remote place approximately 20 meters away on a dirt road in the heart of a national forest. When we arrived, we put up our tent, went for a short trek, and took photos of the surroundings. We observed a few cars parked near two tents and decided to stop and speak with the other campers nearby because we had heard there was going to be a major storm. That night, four guys from Arizona reassured us that the storm would probably not be too bad in our area. That was enough to persuade us to stay. While strolling down the campsite, we came upon a woman with her dog and another elderly woman. We smiled, waved, and kept hiking deeper into the jungle. Let me add that, because of the impending storm, we were one of perhaps 7 campers who chose to stay and weather the night. When we returned to our campsite, we watched the sunset, made sure our car was only a few yards away, and went inside our tent when it became too dark to see. The storm clouds blocked out the stars that night. Because it hadn't started pouring yet, we decided to go to bed right away, hoping to sleep through the storm. When it hit, the wind was fierce, making it difficult to sleep, but we finally got some sleep about 10:30 p.m. I awoke to the sound of thunder rumbling across the mountains and rain pelting my tent. I was a little spooked out and worried about the possibility of flash floods and sliding off the cliff, but I told myself to relax and fell back asleep. At midnight, I awoke again, this time to the sound of something heavy hitting the side of our tent, as if someone was punching it and sliding something down it. When I opened my eyes, it was utterly dark, no light at all. The sound repeated every few minutes, and I was afraid. Then I heard slow, deliberate footsteps near my side of the tent, and my entire body froze. My heart hammered so loudly that I was certain whoever was outside could hear it. Suddenly, I heard a deep sigh from the opposite side of the tent. I began to suspect it might be a bear and realized I might have to confront it. In desperation, I clutched my husband's hand repeatedly, thinking he'd wake up quietly, but instead, he groggily said, "What's wrong? Why are you squeezing my hand?" The footsteps came to a halt almost quickly. After a time, I told him what I had heard. We assured ourselves it was probably only an animal passing by to ease our fears, but the sound of something hitting the tent persisted, increasing my uneasiness. We decided it might be pine cones dropping from the trees above, so we tried to sleep again, figuring we only needed to get through the night and laugh about it later. The tent suddenly collapsed on my husband's side, straight on his head. He murmured, "It feels like something is pushing the tent down." I panicked, picturing a bear sitting on him, but he pulled back, and we heard the familiar sound of something sliding off the tent. We realized it had snowed, and the sound was thick ice falling from the trees. Our tent was covered in thick ice, so my husband pushed from inside until everything slid off. We were relieved that it wasn't a bear and resolved to make it through the night. He turned on the tiny light he had brought, which helped to calm us down. Things seemed regular again, and we both closed our eyes around 3 a.m. My worst nightmare began less than 30 minutes after I had settled down. We heard a woman scream in the pitch-black jungle. She shrieked, "What the? Oh my God! What the?" followed by muffled, frantic sounds, including what sounded like help. Her cries were not furious. They were filled with horror and despair. My husband and I paused and stared at each other. I quickly turned out the light and began muttering rapidly, worried about what we should do. A few minutes later, we heard her again. This time she cried, "No, no, 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 no." As the sound of a car speeding off broke the silence, I was in tears, completely terrified. The silence that followed was deafening, except for the icy rain hitting our tent. It sounded as though she wasn't in the car, but was desperately yelling after it or pleading for help. That was the breaking point. I could handle the bad weather, the potential bear outside, and even the ice falling on our tent, but I could not handle a screaming woman in the middle of the pitch-black woods at 3 a.m. We decided to leave immediately. We quickly gathered our valuables and shuffled to the car, keeping the lights off to avoid attention. My husband went back to grab the tent while I started the car and called 911. I reported what we had heard and where we were. They said they'd send someone, but we knew it would take over an hour for help to arrive, especially given the storm and the rough gravel roads at 3:30 a.m. We started driving out of the campsite, and as we left, my husband noticed something eerie. The four guys we had talked to earlier had left, their cars were gone, but their tents remained as if they had fled in a hurry. As we drove, a chilling thought struck me. Whatever had been walking next to our tent might not have been an animal. It could very well have been a person lurking in the darkness, and that person might have gone after the woman we had seen earlier. I'm not sure what happened on that mountain that night, and I hope everyone made it out safely. I live in a small cul-de-sac in the middle of nowhere. The nearest neighborhood is over 4 miles away. One night a few years ago, we got more than 1.5 feet of snow overnight. Being so far from the main roads, and with it being the weekend, I knew our roads would remain unplowed for quite some time. That morning, I went to my back deck door to admire the snow-draped trees and the still heavily falling flurries. That's when I noticed footprints leading to my door and then turning around and heading away. I looked closer and saw that the tracks came from my neighbor's side. I assumed one of their more delinquent kids had played a joke, as my sledding tube on the railing had been popped. It was still early, so I decided I'd wait a while before calling their parents. Later, I went on Facebook. After scrolling for a bit, I saw a post from one of my neighbors who lives closer to the entrance of our cul-de-sac. She wrote, "Did someone knock for me or something at my back door?" I immediately called her and told her I had an idea of what might be going on. Then I called the first house at the entrance to our neighborhood to explain that the neighbor went outside to check, and sure enough, they found footprints at their back door too. The footprints appeared to come and go in the same way. At this point, everyone in our small community started calling each other. I contacted the family at the far end of the cul-de-sac, and they told me there were no footprints at their home. Then I got a call from my next-door neighbor. She had reached out to the woman who lives in the house next to the last one, and that's when things got even stranger. The woman told her there were footprints leading to her door, but none leading away. By this time, we had already called the police to report the odd activity. However, after learning about the footprints that didn't leave, we called them again and stressed that it was now an emergency. The police informed us that the roads were still unplowed and that they couldn't send a plow truck to clear the way because the plowing company was privately owned. The woman who discovered the footprints at her door was panicking. One of the husbands from across the road, a huge bear of a man, texted her saying he was coming over to invite her over so she wouldn't be alone. He made it to her house, and she left with him for safety. Meanwhile, we set up live feed motion recording hunting cameras to monitor all exits around the houses. Hours passed with no sign of movement. At around 7 p.m., a plow truck finally arrived, followed closely by 3 police cars. The couple who had taken in the woman went back with her to her house while the police searched the property. At first, they didn't find anything. The woman begged them to keep looking, insisting something wasn't right. 2 officers went into her basement again, and this time only one came back up. The officer who returned pulled her aside into another room. We could hear her crying hysterically from outside. By now, nearly everyone in the neighborhood was standing outside. Watching the scene unfold, a group of us started to move toward the house to see what was happening, but several officers stopped us at the door. They informed us they had found someone hiding in a covered opening under the stairwell, a space the woman didn't even know existed. A few minutes later, we saw a scruffy man being dragged out in handcuffs, screaming and kicking, as the police led him away. Inside his little hiding spot, the police found blankets the woman had recently cleaned and stored away. The man had been camped out, in a room directly next to hers. After that night, the woman stayed at other people's homes for a long time before eventually returning to her house. Even then, she refused to stay there alone. The following summer, she sold the house and moved away. It turned out that the man was a thrill-seeking junkie who was on probation for assaulting a family member. According to the police, he had gotten into a fight with his roommate in a neighboring county, stolen the roommate's car, and ended up stranded in our unplowed neighborhood. He had also stolen some electronics from her basement, but since he hadn't left the property with them, the charges for theft didn't stick. The case dragged on for about 4 months. All of us were called as witnesses during the proceedings. It was a terrifying and surreal experience that none of us will ever forget. I still remember vividly the day I almost got abducted. I was 12 years old and lived in an isolated seaside city surrounded by the boreal forest. The closest big town was a 2-hour car drive away, and like many lonely places, the area I grew up in was extremely depraved. Mining town half-Indian reservation, the people there were, and still are extremely prone to violence, theft, and drug or alcohol abuse. From my first year of school up until 4th grade, I went to a nearby school that was 2 small streets or about 200 m away from my home. However, this school didn't have a 5th grade, so I ended up taking the bus for the first time during the year this incident occurred at 6 a.m. I would walk out my front door and a few streets away to a long road with several intersections. Every morning our bus would pick up 3 students at a stop about 100 m ahead, turn in an intersection to pick up other students, then come back to collect us. On days when we felt like sitting down early, we'd walk the extra distance to the pre-intersection stop and get on there first. One morning I left my house earlier than usual. A heavy snowstorm was raging, and I figured the wind and snow would slow me down. Shivering all the way, I noticed that no one was at the other stop, yet I assumed some students might not show up because of the weather, while others were probably still watching the news to see if it was a snow day. Touching my face, I felt spots of hardened cold skin forming on my cheeks. Small frostbites were common in this climate, but I knew they would hurt terribly once they warmed up. To avoid making them worse, I decided to walk to the pre-intersection stop so I could wait there and get out of the cold faster. For a few minutes, it was just me, the howling wind, and the sting of snowflakes hitting my face. Then I noticed an old gray car turning the corner and moving at an astoundingly slow pace in my direction. My heart started pounding as I caught sight of a dirty-looking native man staring at me from the driver's seat. He passed by me and pulled over into the bike lane. I stared at him from across the street, wondering what he was doing out so early, obstructing the bike lane in the middle of a snowstorm. My vision wasn't great. I hadn't yet been diagnosed with any issues, but I squinted as hard as I could to see what was happening inside the car. That's when I realized he was holding something vertically in his left hand. It was pointed directly at me. It was a camera. Panic set in as my muscles froze in place. Paralyzed by fear, why was this man taking pictures of me? What struck me most was how he held the camera using only one hand and holding it sideways. I began to breathe heavily, realizing I was too far from home to run back. Most people in the neighborhood were likely still asleep with their doors locked. I was trapped if this man decided to attack me. I had no way to escape. As the car slowly began to move again, he turned onto my side of the road and crawled closer still at that disturbingly slow pace. I nearly fainted from fear as he reached my stop. His car slowed even more, inching toward me when suddenly a loud humming noise broke through the howling wind. Another car appeared, cutting through the veil of snow like a savior. The native man slammed on the gas pedal and sped off. If it hadn't been for the sudden arrival of that other car, I might have ended up in a situation too horrible to imagine. One of my shipmates arrived seconds later, and I finally gathered the courage to run toward her. 2 years later, the body of a 5-year-old abducted girl was found in the nearby woods. I'll never know if that discovery is connected to what happened to me, but I shudder every time I think about it. There's a chance I was staring directly into the eyes of a murderer that day. I called the police to report the incident and described everything in detail. They assured me they would patrol the area more often, but I never saw a single police car in the neighborhood during the 5 years that followed. As for the picture that man took, I have no idea what happened to it. Maybe it was deleted, maybe it's hanging in some psycho's private collection, or maybe it's out there on some twisted website for others to see. If you ever stumble across a strange site and see a picture of a chubby little girl in a bright pink hat with frostbitten cheeks standing in the middle of a snowstorm, now you'll know the story behind music. This happened a couple of years ago, and is about the only truly creepy encounter I've had in my life. I am a single mother living in a fairly large city in the Midwest with just my toddler. It was winter when this happened, and a fierce snowstorm was blowing outside. I'm a smoker, so despite the weather, I had to go outside to deal with the wind pelting my face with snow while I fed my final craving of the night before heading to bed. My porch is covered with trees in front, so it's hard to see in at night, and I never turn on the porch light when I go out to smoke. It was late, around 11 or 12, and the street was deserted. Although I live in a big city, my neighborhood is really quiet at night, and my street dead ends at a park, so there isn't much traffic. As soon as I stepped outside, I could hear something in the distance. I sparked up my cigarette anyway and looked down the street toward the source of the noise. It sounded like an animal growling. As the noise got closer still about a block away, I could make out a man walking. He was dressed all in black with his hood up, and I couldn't discern any details. Beyond that, he was speaking in a deep, guttural growl. It was the most demonic thing I've ever heard. It didn't sound human, but I know insanity can make people sound inhuman. It's hard to describe just how fear-inducing his voice was. Still, my curiosity got the better of me, and I stood frozen in the storm like a deer in the headlights, watching and listening. I can't remember most of what he said, but I distinctly remember the phrase, "This is the Book of the Dead." He was walking on the opposite side of the road from my house, and had made it to about half a block away. I hadn't moved from directly in front of my door, holding my phone in a death grip inside my pocket, smoking my cigarette as quickly as I could so I could go back inside. He approached the intersection right before my dead-end street, and I hoped he would turn there, but he didn't. He kept walking toward the dead end, still speaking in that deranged, incoherent voice about the Book of the Dead. A million thoughts were racing through my mind. He can't see me, I told myself. He's just some random crazy person. Even as he drew closer, just about across the street from my house, I still couldn't make out any details of his face or see anything beyond his black hood. Suddenly, he stopped talking. He stopped walking. His hood slowly turned in my direction. I dropped my cigarette, rushed inside, and locked the door. Peering out the window, I watched to see what he would do. He just stood there for what felt like 30 seconds, then started walking again. But instead of continuing down the street, he crossed over to my side and stopped directly in front of the sidewalk leading from my door to the street. He stood there facing my house for 3 or 4 minutes. I stood behind my locked door staring at him as he stared back at me. Even though he was only about 20 feet away, his hood still concealed his face. My phone was clutched in my hand as I debated whether to call the cops, but technically he wasn't breaking any laws. He was just standing on the sidewalk staring at my house. The standoff felt like it lasted an hour with my heart pounding in my chest. He was silent the entire time he stood. The only sounds were the wind and the pellets of snow tapping against my windows. Finally, he turned and started walking again. His guttural voice resumed as he headed further down the dead-end street and into the park. I could faintly hear his eerie growl through the door as he walked away, and then he was gone. I checked on my son, who was sleeping soundly. I wish I could say the same for myself. That night this past winter, we had a pretty typical snowstorm here in New Jersey. I'm 17, living at home with my parents and 2 brothers. Typically, my brothers would take care of shoveling, but as luck would have it, both of them and my mother came down with the flu. While they were sick, I took on the responsibilities of cooking, cleaning, and caring for them. My father was on a business trip and couldn't get a flight back to New Jersey due to the weather, so the burden of shoveling fell on me in my town. Failing to clear snow can result in hefty fines, and you're even required to dig out fire hydrants. Now I'm about 5 feet 5 inches and 120 pounds, not exactly a powerhouse, but I can manage shoveling the snow that had fallen. But like most high school girls, I'm usually broke aside from what I earn at my part-time job, so hiring someone to help wasn't an option. About 15 minutes into shoveling, I had cleared off the driveway on one side of the sidewalk. I only had the other side of the sidewalk left to finish. As I turned to head back to complete the job, I noticed a very large middle-aged man walking toward me with a shovel in his hand. I know all my neighbors, so I immediately realized he wasn't anyone who lived near me. He approached with a huge, creepy smile, and I couldn't help but notice his teeth were yellow. I greeted him with a simple hello as he stopped and started talking to me. "Some storm?" he said. I nodded, trying to walk around him to continue my work. As I passed him, I noticed he was trying to make eye contact with me, even dipping his head down a bit to force it. Irritated, I said in my rudest tone, "Excuse me," as if to tell him to get out of my while responded, "Sweetheart, I can't stand to see a young girl put to work like this. Let me help you out." I firmly told him I could manage, but he asked me 3 more times if I was sure. By then I was annoyed and walked away to keep shoveling, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. I realized he was still standing there watching me. Frustrated, I yelled, "Can I help you?" He replied, "Can I help you?" and laughed in a way that sent chills down my spine. Switching tactics, I tried a softer tone. "Sir, I'm pretty much done. I don't need any help. Please just leave me alone so I can finish." He persisted, though saying, "Come on, I charge $35 to do people shoveling for what's left. I'll only charge 10, as I mentioned earlier." I didn't have much money, so I told him, "No sale, take care," hoping he got the point and left. I turned the corner to finish the last 20 feet or so of sidewalk, but when I looked back, the creep was still standing there, agitated and anxious. I rushed inside and informed my mother and brothers that a weird person was troubling and looking at me. My older brother, despite his illness, sprung to his feet, wearing only a t-shirt and sweatpants. He raced out the front door, but the man had already left. And when I say gone, I mean he must have fled the instant I walked inside for assistance. My brother went through the entire neighborhood and couldn't find him. Frustrated, my brother asked whether I was making things up, claiming he wasn't feeling well and didn't like being pulled outside. I vowed to him that I was serious and said I didn't want to go out there again. Later that day, our neighbor completed the remainder of the shoveling for us. After my mother recounted what had happened, he said he'd keep an eye out for anyone who matched the description I gave her. It's a little town where everyone knows each other, and I'd never seen him before that evening. When I saw a Facebook post about a 15-year-old girl from my town being attacked by the same man who had tormented me, I felt a rush of nausea unlike anything I'd ever felt before. I knew it was him since the post featured a photo of his mugshot. The girl had been outside with her father, shoveling snow. Her father went inside briefly to use the restroom and get some coffee, and while he was gone, the man ran up to their house, seized the girl, hit her in the face and torso several times, and produced a knife from his boot. Fortunately, her father witnessed the attack from the window and, together with a neighbor who was also shoveling, intervened. Together, they broke the man's arm and restrained him until the cops arrived. The individual turned out to be a schizophrenic who was off his medicine and rambling around the neighborhood. Something about the girl had triggered him, sending him into attack mode, most likely without him completely comprehending what he was doing. The notion that it could have been me frightens me even today. I feel awful knowing that the girl could have been killed, but I'm so grateful that her father and neighbor were there to protect her before it was too late. As for me, I didn't have anyone watching over me at the time, and that notion alone still bothers me.